So we're back to me again, folks. Hopefully you're not too tired of me going on and my serpiginous way of exploring all these different options. So as you may recall from my presentation or my ongoing talk on this is what we're not going to do, we were exploring different ways, different approaches of including and infusing Indigenous research methods and just how different they can look. I gotta grab my phone 1 second. I look something up. I had meant to include this in the slides, but I was editing them late last night because I had more ideas that I wanted to include. And as an example of the Our Health Counts data and why it's, again, so important, as I keep saying, to include different approaches to understanding it with the questions that we ask, I want to share some more statistics collected by Our Health Counts data about Two-Spirit peoples. So Two-Spirit peoples are, I promise they are not possessed. That's not what that means. It's a sacred ceremonial role where someone identifies as having both male and female spirits within them. And why is a sacred role? It means that they have the ability to see from both sides and hold different medicines. So there's a lot of really special sacred teachings that goes with that role in communities and societies. And it's a beautiful thing, but unfortunately, it's not a very well-known thing. People think they're just kind of like, does that mean you're gay or whatever? Nope, it's a unique thing. Some people may identify as homo or heterosexual or any types of gender dynamics that they may feel. It's a very fluid understanding that has unique cultural teachings. So if you're ever looking at the LGBTQ2IA rainbow, the number 2 refers to Two-Spirit because they often seek services in those communities, which means, unfortunately, that they also live at the intersection of both homophobia and racism and misogyny. So it's a challenging place to be for a sacred being. But in the Our Health Counts data, there's a data sheet that specifically looks into their health information. I'm going to read you some statistics. And remember, it's not the end of the story. So 83% of Two-Spirit Indigenous adults in Toronto live below the before tax low income cutoff. 63% of Two-Spirit Indigenous adults were unemployed. 48% of Two-Spirit Indigenous adults have completed high school or post-secondary education. And 33% of Two-Spirit Indigenous adults experience homelessness. Not painting a really pretty picture about like economic and housing stability, right? The interesting thing is that just below that, there's also querying around resiliencies and cultural strengths. Over 3 out of 5 Two-Spirit Indigenous adults in Toronto had good, very good, or excellent ability at handling stress. So when we initially see these numbers, we're like, uh-oh, this is a very like deficit-based model of understanding. Like there's obviously coping with significant and substantial stressors, but 79% participated in traditional Indigenous ceremony, 57% used traditional Indigenous medicines, like these, to maintain their health and well-being. 81% had a strong sense of belonging in the Indigenous community, and 99% felt good about their Indigenous heritage. And at first we might think like, okay, well, how can both numbers be so positive and so strong and so like negative and strong? But I think it's really important that we appreciate how these numbers go together. And this is why everything I've been saying about context becomes so important. You can suffer through economic hardship and find a home in community. And that's a crucial element of health and well-being that informs how you navigate through the world and how you understand cultural strengths. And also from that point of view, when we're thinking about strategically about like policy or funding dimensions, we can know then that these cultural centers, these traditional medicines, these kind of cultural approaches can do such a powerful element of sustaining the health and well-being for Indigenous Two-Spirit peoples as they're navigating housing loss or experiences of homelessness or high health rates. It allows them to navigate them with strength and security as opposed to becoming another unfortunate or difficult statistic. So I want to keep these statistics in mind. Okay, so this slide was up before. Some people have probably heard about these letters, OCAP. I'm going to review them with you because I think it gives an interesting introduction into what we think about when it comes to research ethics. Maybe we can do a survey. Who here has heard of OCAP? No, one? Okay, two. Okay, so OCAP stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession. And I mean, it stands for different things, but it's a new set and standard of Indigenous research ethics, but it's uniquely specific for First Nations. It's very flexible in its construction to be applied to other Indigenous research, but it's known to be appreciated for First Nations peoples. where other Métis or unique communities might have specific like research guidelines for their perspectives. So when it comes to ownership, and I don't know, I think it's the way I was thinking about the slide when I was putting it together a couple days ago, and I think it is, I'm going to use an interesting phrase. It's a translation of Indigenous knowledge principles in a Western setting. So the reason why I say that is because um, much like when we think about like land ownership, the idea that you would own a piece of land is a very Western based concept that you would own that land. Because when we think about it very broadly, and as actually we've seen from some teachings and some interviews of people in Greenland right now, they actually in their government in their law systems, you can't own the land. You can own the house on top of the land, but the land is for everyone. And that's a very common Indigenous perspective to connection to land. So why I say that is similarly, knowledge has trails and we respect where knowledge comes from, but no one owns knowledge. The challenge is in Western Indigenous or Western institution and education services. If you don't protect things through ownership, then people can steal it and profit off of you. Another element that I forgot to bring up is that it's probably more than this, but approximately 25% of the pharmaceutical industry and products in the pharmaceutical industry are actually based on Indigenous practices and traditional knowledges. Like Advil comes from willow tree bark, like the active ingredient, and that was known from Indigenous knowledges, but no one paid for that. They just took that principle, applied it, and made billions of dollars off of it. So this is what we mean when they're like, okay, in the absence of firm boundaries in Western systems around what ownership means, unfortunately, it's prime for piracy. So when we think about ownership when it comes to Indigenous knowledge in research settings, ownership refers to the relationship of First Nations to their cultural knowledge, data, and information. This principle states that when we're appreciating ownership with rights to Indigenous knowledge protection and Indigenous IP, what's it called? Intellectual property, states that a community or group owns their information collectively in the same way an individual owns his or her personal information. And we'll look at what this means later, or in a slide or two. With control affirms that First Nations, their communities, and representative bodies are within their rights in seeking control over all aspects of research and information management processes that impact them. So when we think back to that tribe that had their data samples taken and then they did not know or did not consent to what was being done with that information, that's a violation of an OCAP principle of control. First Nations control or of research can include all stages of a particular research project from start to finish. So I shared that when I do my interviews with people and I share the themes, when I share that back to them, that's a principle of good standard, hopefully, of control where I'm like, this is the information that's being included in the data set. This is how it appears. These are some of the quotes. Was you want me to change things? What do you want me to know about this information? Or also, do you want me to remove it entirely? They still retain their rights to their information. They're able to have everything stricken from the record. They keep their honorarium. Everything is theirs, but they have to have a say in what's being presented and the control and knowledge of the fact that they can withdraw at any time. Access. So First Nations must have access to information and data about themselves and their communities, regardless of where it is held. Again, when we think back to that blood sample information, or example, there was another example too where I think someone just like literally took the blood samples and just ran off to like the UK. Like they just shipped everything and heaved home. So they have to have knowledge and information regarding where the information is being held, who's holding it, how can they access it, and also how is it being stored and protected. So very commonly when we click that Indigenous engagement box on the REB, there's strict protocols about who has access to the information, how long is it being held for, which is standard for REB, but very typically it has to be specified that it's being held by an Indigenous researcher. And then possession, so it refers to the physical control of data, well, kind of like I just mentioned. Is the mechanism by which ownership can be asserted and protected. Now, again, these are pretty broad guidelines, and I had a student actually talk to me. He's like, I don't know how to do OCAP. And I was like, okay, well, first off, talk to the community about what they feel comfortable with that you're working with, but also it's supposed to be a bit broad to allow communities directions about how they want their information stored and what capacity they have in their own communities. So another example of when I was working with When I was working at a dimension of a dimension, a department at U of T before coming to Unity Health, we actually were partnered with Anishinaabe Health Toronto, and another researcher had collected some information on Indigenous biological data, and it wasn't following OCAP principles, which happens sometimes. They just end up collecting Indigenous participants because they didn't either know they were Indigenous or they later identified later. So they're like, what do we do with this information? They went to AHT and they said, what do you guys want us to do with it? And they said, well, we don't really have a research department the same way other people do. We can contact this other like Indigenous researcher and they can hold and control the possession of it. So in that way, it seems a little bit splintered, but if certain communities or certain institutions have research capacities, they'll be able to hold on to the data and negotiate what that collaboration looks like. In the absence of those capacities, because not everyone may have a research department, they can work with local or familiar or partnered researchers to then navigate the processes to protect the data and to understand and interpret it appropriately. And that's what happened with the project. They gave the information to us. We ended up processing it and working towards publishing it, but also asking different questions of the data and understanding it within a cultural context. So there's a study or a discussion done by Fournier and Stewart that looked at Indigenous ethical principles and OCAP followings. I have the article linked, but I can't remember the whole title right now, where they did a review of different ethical proceedings for Indigenous research that's being done. And two quotes stand out. So one, we heard there is a lack of reciprocity in research. This refers to a situation where research conducted on or with Indigenous communities benefits only the researcher, while it should also benefit the communities being studied, which makes sense. I mentioned all that stuff around reciprocity and what that looks like. The challenge is very commonly, and I understand to an extent, where when we think about relational reciprocity when it comes to research, we're like, do you want to be a co-author? Like it might be hard to think of like how can we actually benefit unless we ask the question of what do you guys need? What can we help you with? Is it mentorship? Is it training? Is it funding? What does that look like? But it always has to be asked because the metrics like Dr. Smiley mentioned of social currency and social value of an article is one thing and it's esteemed in our practice, but again, out on the streets, that doesn't mean much because you have other problems that you have to attend to. They also noted, our research also revealed a lack of adherence to Indigenous ethical principles and data sovereignty guidelines, such as OCAP, for research involving First Nations. Researchers too often don't understand what self-determination in research is and what it involves. And this contributes to the fact that there are still academic researchers and university policies that enable research harms. Not enough time is devoted to engagement with communities and building trusting relationships, and that it is not done in a timely manner. So it might be done like Megan mentioned, like maybe it's done after the fact, or maybe it's someone approaching like, hey, we have this data, what do we do with it? And it can be a little bit challenging because we don't always know what we don't know, but it becomes our obligation as safe researchers and good scientists to say, okay, if it's going to be involving Indigenous peoples, let's start asking other experts and other questions to make sure we're doing the best job that we can, which leads us to, oh, actually, I was a slide ahead. So I'll pause there before I jump into what what this leads us to. So I have here lessons from COVID and distrust in vaccine uptake. So I'd like to share a couple stories really quickly, just because I think it is a really important element of the intersection between science, health, and Indigenous research practices. And Dr. Smiley mentioned this before when we were having our vaccination clinics. Part of the research that we were looking at is exploring especially homeless populations' experiences with vaccine uptake and their willingness or distrust of vaccination procedures. And we heard a lot. Some people were like, I made a very intentional decision. I live in a crowded setting. I don't want to contract COVID and like contaminate or risk my family units. I absolutely signed up and I don't have any qualms about the research. Other people, though, were very specific. And like Dr. Smiley mentioned, were very distrustful of especially a new technology and especially any vaccination whatsoever. And what we found was that it wasn't only about distrust of the science and the research, but also distrust of the mechanics of the vaccine itself. They said they saw a lot of information around what the vaccine was and how to like navigate it, but they didn't say why the science was new or were there risks involved. And while it was like a burgeoning science at the time and understanding, there was just a big push to tell people to do things. And they're like, I can't make an informed decision and I already have so much distrust, therefore I'm not going to do it. And I think that taught me a tremendous amount when we were not only doing this research and also interpreting the data and getting that community feedback, but it taught me a lot of lessons about if you're, number one, like I mentioned when I first introduced myself, if there's a tremendous amount of distrust, and you can't just make trust. You can't promise someone that you're going to do the best job possible. You can't hope and promise that someone can trust you and that you're trustworthy. They don't know you. But what you can do is create the best situation and the best environment possible so safety and trust can arise. And typically that means concerted effort over a period of time. But what that can also mean is understanding best applied principles and practices. So I'll give you an example of that in the next slide. But just before I share or just before I get there, I want to share actually the reason why I actually came on board with this project, which I kept meaning to bring up. As I, again, have mentioned, this isn't actually my wheelhouse. I don't have any of the wet lab skills that you all do, which is beautiful and phenomenal. And please teach me your ways. But actually, like, I'm a psychologist and I do qualitative research and I work in the community doing mental health support. And all those things have like very little to do with mitochondria and transplantation and AI and bioprocessing and engineering. I trust that in your steady hands. But what happened was Dr. Ori Rothstein called me one day. And when your boss calls you, you listen. First and foremost, he was like, hey, I have this really interesting project. And I think it would be cool for you to come on board. So again, I'm like, okay, I'll listen. But the thing is, if another specialist, another physician is very excited about a potential, if other experts in this field are really thrilled about the potential applications of a research, I'm gonna pay attention. I trust other experts and I trust that their hearts are in good places and they want to do good things. And then I met with Hannah and we kept discussing, collaborating. But interestingly, one of the options that was positioned as a potential outcome from this research was prolonging the longevity of transplanted organs, which makes sense. And is one of the many possibilities. Now, there's other studies or other research, if you actually explore, where there's some teachings in traditional communities where there's actually lessons or knowledge about a little bit against transplantation. Now, that's not all Indigenous people, but some communities are concerned or wary because of spiritual processes and guidelines. And there's other religious groups that have the same thing. But interestingly, on the flip side of that, there was an elder at the time that I had worked with in homelessness. She was also actually married to another elder, and she was undergoing the search for a liver transplant at the time. Like I had just seen her post on Facebook that were recommending, like, can you or someone you know, like, get tested to see if this might be a match. She had a series of health issues at the time, and a liver transplant would have been a really powerful source of support for her in her recovery. And her teachings were okay with transplantation. There was no problem. And I thought to myself, I was thinking about like the wonderful stories she had shared with me and sitting in ceremony with her and all the work that she has done in working with other Indigenous groups and Indigenous like street involved youth. Like we were talking about, again, unfortunately, um, Mr. Sinclair, who died because of like neglect in a hospital system, but she would share how like when she sees like a Native person on the street, she just will like go like, hey, can like she's like, I'll see people like slumped over and no one, people just walk by them and no one even asks if they're okay. And sometimes they are okay, but she's like, I always stop and ask. So clearly a powerfully hearted person who's very dedicated to the community. And I kept thinking, I was like, you know what? I don't know if I'd be a good match for this liver transplant for her. I don't know how much I can do personally. But if this project was just a little bit farther along, it might give her or people like her the choice to take a liver transplant because it would make those livers more viable or those organs more viable. So that whether it's within her teachings or not, she has a choice that won't ask her to compromise her safety or her health and well-being before she can access a potentially, broad dimension of health and well-being and organ transplantation so she can continue to be a grandmother and a teacher and an elder in our community. Unfortunately, she passed away this past summer due to related health issues, but I always think about the importance of it's not just numbers and patients, it's maybe the woman who actually is like, and again, a recognized elder in our community who takes care of the homeless, and that's the person we're trying to protect. Maybe we can't save everyone, but maybe we can take care of another person if this knowledge is done in the right way. The challenge, though, is again, all these healthcare and research principles that are very prominently in the back of my mind. So when I was thinking about, okay, if this information, if this study was done in a way that was safe for her to access, what would have to be there? And that leads us to finally this side. So again, I mentioned I'm not, there's certain elements I'm not 100% on when it comes to research and clinical trials. There's lots of things and lots of further advancements that we're trying to co-explore together. But what I wanted to have in terms of what safety looks like for our research elements is that if we, and I was speaking with other researchers too, that are like, I'm trying to look up rates of Indigenous access to. Bye, Anna. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Yeah. Oh, bye. Oh my gosh. Hey, everyone, send nice warm vibes to Anna. Bye.
The best. You guys did a
Yeah,
phenomenal job.
thank you. Take care. Okay.
Thank you so much for everything.
Of
Sorry
course.
to interrupt.
No, 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 not at all. Okay, stay warm. Toodles. Um, so again, like I was mentioning, the challenge is that if you go home and you're trying to Google like what's the information on like Indigenous like mitochondrial transplantation things, you're not going to find a lot. Actually, me and Madeline were just saying like if you Google certain things, you're not going to see a whole lot of data and representation on the rates of different disorders for just the same reasons that I spent the whole day telling you about. But what we can try and do is very strategically and very kindly listen to who has the expertise and how can we learn best principles and practices. So for the Mitochondrial Revolution project, what I'm planning on doing and continuing to do is looking at different areas of expertise. So first off, exploring knowledge of what does a successful clinical trial actually looks like with Indigenous engagement and exploration. What has safe collaborations looked like in practice, and what are foundational to safe clinical trials? So what does collaboration and community look like in practice when it comes to clinical trials? Then from there, working and talking to like the other experts, so people like Dr. Smiley and other physicians and healthcare and biochemical experts. So doing interviews, reviews, consultations with other types of healthcare scientists and asking them, where should this science be applied, which is what we would turn to for our elders. We have this information. This is the science that we have. In your view, what are the biggest issues for our communities and our patients? And what would that look like with this technology if it was advanced? And how can we apply it safely? And then again, where are your concerns? What's the concerns around data ownership, clinical trial possession? Where does it need to be housed? How do we follow those principles? And what does that look like in this context? And then again, we also have elders. So speaking to elders and traditional knowledge keepers for cultural wisdom, where are your concerns for our people? Similar, because they often will tell us, they're like, yeah, we love research. Go out and ask this question and go here and there. But they will also be like, you know what, even in my own community, this is a huge issue. This is a huge issue. We need to see, can this apply to there? And if not, how can we support that effort? But otherwise, like Dr. Smiley said, sometimes they'll say no, and that's okay. But we need to be able to ask. We have this opportunity. We have this science. It could be good, much like I was reflecting, it could be good. It's probably good. How can we make sure we do it as safely as possible? And then again, does this violate certain communities' burial, ceremonial, or spiritual protocols, or is it okay? So these are some elements around when we're gathering and cultivating expertise and building the foundation of what safety looks like for this project. If we don't know what we don't know, these are the places that can help inform our foundations and our mindsets towards taking care of things safely. The good news is I've already done some initial research on some scoping reviews that have explored what commonalities among clinical trials look like. I've made some connections with other participants and other researchers in Alberta who are very focused on clinical trials. So there's good work being out there, but we have to build the relationality. And that can take a little bit of time. But I'm very persistent and I like to ask questions. So OCAP in practice. Now this isn't like tried and true just yet, but a very like initial understanding so far for OCAP in practice for this type of project would be something along the lines of when it comes to ownership, the biological samples, data, and analysis and transcripts belong to the participants who gave them or to the community research hub that is housing them. That might not necessarily be me. Like again, if I'm working with an Indigenous community that has their own research hub, they might want to house the information there, and then we have a co-sharing agreement. It's very common in REBs. It seems technical, but it's process. And it does not belong to anyone else. And the idea of belonging is very challenging, but there's either co-ownership or collaborative access agreements that are available. When it comes to control, Indigenous patients and participants can withdraw their samples or data from any point at any point in time. Now, this can be a bit of a hang up when it comes to like, oh gosh, what are we going to do if we finally get the sample and then we're using it and they ask for it back? Well, can we do that? Good science means that we just have to, and that can be frustrating sometimes, but I think it's more important that, again, when there's those trust ruptures, we honor and follow through as best we can. Again, with access, Indigenous patients and participants should be able to access their information results throughout the dissemination process, throughout their research field as a whole. So what that can look like, again, is if there's like themes from some of these commonalities or themes from some of these interviews with different consultants, that I'm able to forward it right there, or that even along the way as the project develops, or like maybe they just want information about how the data is like turning out. So we can share with them like team updates about like, so this is what we found broadly in our project. This is what some of the science is saying is helpful. This is how the things are going. And then for Indigenous patients, we're finding these things are happening. Maybe it's just confirming knowledge overall. What else can be really important too is, again, keeping people kind of afloat throughout the research process, or maybe some communities, maybe all the communities, who knows, we're willing to find out, is like maybe they need more information before they're feeling comfortable to submit their, either through testing or through some of the collaboration work. So maybe they want to see more clinical trials, either in porcine or in other animal studies or in the organ on a chip models that we're developing. Maybe they want to see how that actually plays out so they can make an informed decision to move on to either collection or information. All these things have to be listened to and available as we're being responsive and as protective of Indigenous data as we can. And then again, finally, possession. Samples may be held in identified and trusted Indigenous laboratories if they exist, or if they're nearby. Sometimes it can depend on transfer, or Indigenous scientists can request transfer of data or just help with collaboration. So that could be me or Janet, or just helping be involved in different labs and across different labs about where is the Indigenous data being held? Are we able to take care of it appropriately? And if there's questions, are we able to retract it just in case? It's all these questions become available. So just kind of a bit of a modeling, a bit of a template of what OCAP could look like in this practice, but it could look very different based on the expertise that's afforded to us. So I like making things rhyme. So I said, okay, or no way. So very commonly in Indigenous research or even community investments, you'll see consultation, but you'll also see that there's another element that's called consultation is not consent. So very commonly, especially in environmental groups, you'll see that there's a lot of Indigenous consultation or consultation with local leaders, but that doesn't actually mean that they said okay or that they're willing to collaborate. That means you ask them questions and they gave their opinion, and then you could have just thrown that out the window. So I think there's a very, unfortunately, there's a very prominent discussion around consultation is not consent when it came to the Grassy Narrows community, which were consulted and then subsequently like about what they wanted. I think it was for a pipeline or a water line. I'm going to have to do more information and digging. And it actually, they said no, they were not for it. And then the funding or the research group said, that's no problem. Haha, we consulted. We didn't heed any of their information. We went and did what we wanted to do, and now it led to mercury poisoning. But they were able to check off that box. So it's another element of like, where are the differences with consultation? And then how does that look different to collaboration? And collaboration is very foundationally what I've been talking about very strongly, which is what do you want this research to look like? How do you want it produced? What kind of dissemination efforts are meaningful? And how can we support our communities through these types of works? So I promise we're getting close to the end of me talking all the time. So Indigenous approaches to research. I've mentioned they're very involved, they're very trust building, they're very research focused, and that takes a little bit longer. It's a little bit slower. People don't like that. That's okay. As we're very used to working and being successful in this type of institution, that means that we're used to probably working way later, and we all love coffee. So we have to go against our biological clocks to do what we have to do in a timely manner, especially when there's funding cycles. It's not a traditional approach. I understand that. So much of what I've said with regard to community reciprocity isn't usually in your wheelhouse or in your research methods class whatsoever. The withdrawal of information can be really spooky when it comes to like, we work so hard to gather this data and we're scientists, and it can seem scary. So far, I haven't had anyone ask to withdraw their data. That being said, I only work so much in biological samples. But again, I think what's important is when we create and understand the foundations of what safety looks like, then that means there's less vague questions for when people agree to consent and participate in this data. And again, some of these things may not include Indigenous data until results emerged for formal and informed consent. But what that means is when we do all these things, number one, We have the moral upper hand of saying that we did things the right way. We tried to collect as much information as possible from the communities that this impacts the most. We're trying to make the most meaningful impact and a chance at inclusion that helps to change protocols for meaningful science. So that way, if I'm going to communities or if I'm going to experts and I'm like, hey, we have like maybe requests for biological sampling, how do you feel about that? They can turn around and ask, okay, so what are you going to do if someone wants to say no? Then we've followed all the expertise and guidelines of what people do when they say no or how we can include, and we know what questions to ask to make sure that we're handling everything appropriately and also that they feel safe and knowing who we are and what we're planning on doing, and that if there's changes along this step of the way, we're regaining consent. So if there's another additional method of testing we want to do, we can ask if it's okay and they can give us the yay or the nay, and then we work with what's available. It is longer, but the benefits are that much more powerful and meaningful and help transform patient and research relationships moving forward. And again, like I mentioned, if the relationships are rich, if they're long lasting, if they're trusting, they last a lifetime because you've worked together, you've built something together, and you're listening to each other. And then that helps really to benefit everybody. Um, Now this is part 3. And this one I don't have to talk as much, which is really great. And that means you can talk to each other and not just have me talk at you. So these are next steps for personal, interpersonal. I included policy, but that's actually not true. But anyway, there's obviously a lot that we've taken in today, and there's so much more you can learn. But I tried to make it easy for you and divvy it up into different sections, which will then be circulated. So a lot of people are like, this is a lot of information. You told me a lot about genocide and historical atrocities. How much can one person do? A lot. One, I always like to invite people, just understand your history. And I think that becomes important because when we appreciate what this land, what Canada means to our families, if we're non-Indigenous, or as I shared, like I'm not traditional to this territory, well, then we're better able to understand our roles as caretakers and allies on this land. So asking what land is your family from? Why did they leave? What land do you live on? Who are the original caretakers? Is it unceded? And also, what don't you know? You can incorporate different things to read, Indigenous books into your reading lists or podcasts to continue learning. I covered so much information and yet also somehow not enough, which is wild, but there's so much out there. And it's all available for you to learn, I promise. And most of it's for free. There's documentaries, movies you can watch if you, I know many of us are students and that's okay. But if there's donations or anything to make available in the lab, there's organizations and charities that are available, or even building capacity. You can contact your local MP if you really want to help foster things. But there's also, again, lots of ongoing courses, books, documentaries. You can attend different powwows because you're like, people keep mentioning culture. What's that about? Powwows are free. There's actually one commonly on my birthday, which rocks here in Toronto. It's the Name Res Powwow. You usually see it on the news, and it's free and open to everyone. And it's a great place to shop and hear music and just see a little bit more about what the culture is about. I took my best friend there this year when we were there. And she was like, the second I heard the drumming, something in my bones shifted. Not that she was going to break something, but she's just like, it felt like this very powerful like thing in the drumming. She's like, this is really beautiful. And I was like, yeah, the culture rocks. And it's just a cool way to like see what people fought so hard to protect and what is so prominent about the community. And if we really want, maybe one day we can set up a booth there so we can ask people questions too. And again, I'm just one person, attend courses, advance your learning. I know we're all very experts in our own fields, and there's only so much time we have in a day, but there's a lot of really magnificent literature and work about Indigenous history, but also just Indigenous art and stories. You might even see some around, which is always recommended. And where you work, have Indigenous representation, art, posters, decor, promote employment initiatives. Like I mentioned, if there's a student position, send it to like an Indigenous grad office so that they can circulate. Having flexibility and meaningful engagement, looking into cultural safety training, sharing some of these resources I'm continuing to bombard you with. Again, same thing. So investing in cultural safety training, and there's a variety, and so many of them are free because we just want the knowledge out there. There's other Indigenous partnerships and labor initiatives that are available for advertising job opportunities or connecting for supports and education. There's other Indigenous research centers, some of which I'm part of. Oh, I'm part of all of these. Okay, that sounds like a plug, but I'm connected with them. But if you have other questions, I can help connect you further. Or again, they just have resources and information available. And that's what we're focusing on, gathering and collecting research in a good way so it can guide our pathways forward. So we're not reinventing the wheel. If you're looking or know someone who's looking for Indigenous resources in Toronto, there's oodles of shelters and housing services, which is great. There's health services, also great. There's employment and education systems. I told you I got a lot of resources. Also great. Cultural centers, fantastic. And also many of them offer different like either drop-ins or places you can go to learn more. And then again, further information and reading. So that's always good, including land acknowledgements. That's actually, these are all specifically land acknowledgements, but there's further reading included in all these other slides. And I think that's finally where I get to stop talking. Ah, nope, just kidding. More reading. My screen just went to sleep. Okay, so some documentaries to watch, more books. Don't worry, Bonnie, I'm at the end. So some books to, again, to include your reading. And I know it's a lot of reading, and it can feel very overwhelming and exhausting. Oh my God, that's all I had to do and I made you get up. Sorry. So there's a lot of really wonderful options to just help expand a little bit of knowledge of where we're from. There are also really beautiful stories. We spent a lot of time today looking at where the problems are and where the barriers are. But even from that one example I shared about our health counts data and the two-spirit dimensions and reports, when we actually focus on the culture and the cultural resurgence, that's where we see a tremendous amount of strengths. Our survival, our culture, our perspectives, our rich, beautiful histories are worth hearing and listening more from. And they're really cool. They're really cool. And it might offer a different way of being that might be softer than just some of the Cartesian split that I introduced us to. It might make space for our hearts and our minds, as well as anything we might find spiritual. My final note before we begin to break into some discussion groups is, and I can't remember who said it, and that's on me as a bad scientist for not remembering who said it, is that Indigenous sciences and scientists are wonderful science. We're very rigorous, we're very determined science. It's just that our science includes the heart. And I think that's a very important aspect that might seem non-objective, but it always centers the human being and sense making and meaning making in the world around us, so that we remember the work we're doing has a valuable purpose for people with lives. So I think we can move on to the next segments where we begin to break into smaller groups. But depending on what time it is, maybe we could have a little stretch. Mhm. Yeah, sure, if we can. Yeah, okay. That sounds good. Well, good news, like a lot of resources. You have a lot of reading there on the sheets that was emailed out in case you want further readings, but and I can try and ask questions. Are there any questions? Because I know talked up here for so many hours. Any questions or anything you want me to go back or clarify on? Yeah, I can send them out. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. I think we should be asking that. I don't think we're at the stage where we're collecting that information yet, are we? No, not yet. When we do, that would be something that we would have to flag as, does this person identify as Indigenous, yes or no, and then gain further information. With the idea that then we can like label it, we can follow through with the protection, where it's housed, and what those are like right now. But as far as I'm concerned, not yet. So that'll be in development. But again, the policies and procedures will be developed through some more of these consultations and discussions. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. So my plan is that when I'm asking all these questions with either communities, with elders, with other experts, that kind of like what Dr. Smiley did with our health counts data is be like, if you're interested, if you know other people who would be great to be involved in the study, or if you want to follow along, if you want to join our team, that way we can keep going out and out and out and collaborating. And then for community members themselves, when we're asking discussions, we're like, if you want to be involved as like a community research assistant or just follow along on what the project is, we'll be able to have materials provided for them, and offer either feedback, either ongoing, or just further knowledge about what the benefits are or what the next steps are. Mhm. Ooh, you know what? Actually, we were talking about this, Madeline. What might be really helpful is across like all these different departments, all our different many branches of our work, is even offering like a bit of a background about like what kind of work do you do in very accessible terms, so that if we're working with a community member, regardless of their educational background, we can get a better sense of what kind of team members are involved in this project, and then what does that look like for the data sample? Almost kind of like following the trail of like where does the data go? How is it used, and what does that look like? So some of the development of materials, first off, we can totally ask like more formally, but if it would be interesting or helpful, saying like, if we're kind of like asking like a layperson on the street or just anybody, what does your role actually look like? What kind of science do you do? What questions are you asking? And what does that role look like for this project? Sometimes that can be a really helpful way of helping people understand not only the project and the science itself, but all the different branches that are included and help understand the process. Kind of like with the vaccine clinics I mentioned, the challenge is that a lot of people, they're like, I don't know what that means. I don't understand that heavy duty science. It's kind of hidden behind this like scientific label. But if we're able to share our perspectives and our science and our background and our procedures, then we're able to demystify and kind of de-scarify those processes. And then they have a better understanding of what's happening and then can make an informed decision with every information. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. It's good seeing you again. I know. Mhm, mhm, mhm. Oh. Mm, mhm. Yeah. Yeah. That's a wonderful question. Thank you. I think a big part of it would, the first thing that came to mind is just having more Indigenous people as scientists, as leaders, as students, as researchers across the board. And we hear this as an example for when people are looking for access to primary care in a safe way. One of the biggest things they usually say is, I'd love Indigenous representation, whether that's artwork, whether that's like a sign in a traditional language, or like an Indigenous healthcare practitioner. So I think one of the first steps that we can try and do is number one, try and navigate through our own sense of overwhelm, which is natural and understandable. I threw so much information at everyone, but exploring what can I do right now? Maybe I can try Indigenous outreach to Indigenous service centers or student centers, and just create opportunities for applications. Maybe it's not the right fit, maybe it's, but it might be important, even doing, and this might be a bit of a time effort, but like doing Indigenous presentation or presentations in Indigenous streams or for Indigenous students, so they understand what labs can be done or what that looks like for science long term, and then they know you exist and can apply for either mentorship or training. I think the biggest thing would be having increased representation so that we have the tools ourselves to collaborate, and it's not all on just a couple different researchers or different people, that the burden of reconciliation is shared among all of us and we're able to collaborate together. So I think that's where mentorship and training become really important, but also, and that's where I use the word targeted, which can be a little bit difficult, but that can be where when we're circulating job opportunities, sending it to Indigenous like grad offices or student centers can be really valuable, because it helps understand and bridge gaps where they might not have access to like Unity Health postings or other postings, but it might be like a perfect fit for their research. I know some of the information I provided talks about Indigenous biological engineering students and some supports that they're offering. And the challenge is there's like, I'm guessing only a few of them, but they're there. So it would be wonderful to either connect with them or again, see a little bit more about their education. And then at least again, help uplift those that are on that track to help, I guess, broaden some of the research involvement. So I think just helping students, we can't, you're right, it'll go on beyond us. It's a little bit beyond one lifetime, but we can try and keep the door open and help people along the way. Does that make sense? Is that broad? Okay. Anyone else? Also, I keep saying, I was like, I gave you a lot of information. And I know it's a lot. And you're like, I'm tired. Please let me go, woman. But if you have information, you're like, wait a second, what was that again? Just email me, like reach back out and be like, hey, what was that again? Can you like remind me of that? Or I had a question that came up later. I think the challenge is that there's so much information and it's hard to imagine how it's applied like perfectly. But that's why this is called strengthening our foundations. We want to have like a good understanding of when the next time there's like an Indigenous event, or if like there's an email that talks about like Indigenous protocols that came from some of this research, you'll understand why it's important. So that's why I want to make sure we had these conversations and knowledge, and we can hopefully keep building and applying how it works for you. But again, there's lots of QR codes and clickable links in the PDF that's on the tables there with you for a little bit more learning, a little bit more reflection. It might apply to you, it might not, but at least it's a jumping point for how Indigenous science and sciences can blend together in a good way. Mhm. Any other questions? Yes. Mhm. How dare you learn? Yeah, let's go all the way back. Sorry, please look away from the screen if you are susceptible to flashing lights, because I'm going fast. Okay, where is it? Ah, this one. So this one, you can text about the city and province. I think it's just in Canada. There's also different websites that will tell you more information, and those are clickable links that will be in the slides later. Mhm. Yay. Anything else? Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 One concern only. Oh my gosh. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that might be something we keep discussing and exploring, because if I had a perfect answer for that, I'd be able to sell lots of textbooks, which is great. But I think you bring up a really essential point of that as much as there's like these four domains and we think that they're all very separate. um, much like our different like physiological actual systems, they have to communicate with each other. That's how we stay alive. So like again, I might practice psychology, but I have to at least have some understanding of the physiological and emotional like dysregulation that occurs when someone's experiencing like heightened distress. I have to know what's happening on in the body, and I have to have some semblance of information. With a lot of like again like bio-focused scientists, it's understandable that it might be a large difficulty to have expertise in everything. But like you said, we're pretending like these systems are discrete, and they're not. They can't be. Otherwise, we would die because our systems can't be separated or vivisected, right? But I think what becomes important is that we can do the best diligence in science that we can for our area. But remember, there might be like an X factor element. There might be or be kind of curious for next steps about what happens when these things intersect. And I think that's the challenge of trying to perfect a science, is that we can't quite, because we can, narrow it down in a lab and know how it works in a sterile environment. But when it's in a bodily system, and that bodily system responds to stress or toxins or the environment, it can be an entirely different system that will react very differently. Something I'll share, again, it might seem a little bit abstract, but I promise it kind of connects to biology and chemistry, is that I was doing an interview with an elder for experiences in primary care settings, and they were talking about how, as much as I smudged in this room, a lot of places have no smudge policies when it comes to hospital settings and ERs, and that's understandable to a degree. But what they also do is they will introduce, they'll try and find different ways around that, because smudge, like I mentioned, can be very grounding when we're feeling really overwhelmed. There's also, what's neat is they've done more scientific experiments where they found that when smudge is like lit for longer periods of time, it actually acts as like an antibacterial in the room, which is neat. So while they couldn't smudge with smoke in the ER, this elder was sharing about how when they were caring for their loved ones, what she did instead is she created like almost like a tea kind of, where she like soaked some of the medicines in water and used it as like an aqua smudge, and she would put that on the pillow by her mom's pillow, just to help her smell that and just to help her ground. And I shared with her, I was like, I actually don't know if you're familiar with this, but like, of course, scents are very comfortable, but we have more DNA in our bodies dedicated to decoding scents, like scent alone, than all of our other senses combined, which is wild. Well, maybe not combined, but pretty strong. What we appreciate as our olfactory system, it's not just comforting. There's a tremendous amount of impact that can have in something as simple as just a scent. And we might not fully understand what that collaboration looks like, but if we think that even to that person it's calming, we already know it might help inflammation in the body, it might help avoid stress responses, it might help facilitate their healing a little bit faster, because they have something that's so central to their well-being. So there's lots of considerations and intersections. I think we just